Welcome back for more physiology. Today we're going to be dealing with muscle reflexes, so our first round of dealing with reflexes. And in particular, we're going to look at how reflexes deal with muscles and glands. So first helps if we review. We have an action potential, it's moving down a neuron. We have depolarization, sodium ions flowing in, repolarization, potassium ions flowing out, makes the cell go from negative to positive back to negative again on the inside. Eventually that's going to reach the terminus. At that point, we're going to release neurotransmitters. In particular, we're going to release acetylcholine in this particular case. It's going to go from the presynaptic membrane through the synapse and bind to a receptor on the postsynaptic membrane, where it will trigger another depolarization. You get the entire skeletal muscle that will start to depolarize. When it depolarizes, it's going to cause the sarcoplasmic reticulum, or the SR, to open up and release calcium ions. Those calcium ions are then going to bind to the thin filament in the sarcomere, which is the contractile unit of the muscle. When it binds, it allows for the actin and myosin, so the thin and thick filaments, to interact with each other. When they interact or create a cross bridge, they will immediately pivot, dragging the edges of the sarcomere in towards the center. We call that a power stroke. Through the addition of ATP, we break the cross bridge, reset, reattach the cross bridge, and we continue the cycle provided that we have calcium ions, we have depolarizations, and we have more ATP. This turns out to be useful inside of what we would call a reflex, which is one of the places where we automatically take nerve and muscle and connect the two together. So where are we going from here? All reflexes have 5 basic components. They have a receptor, which is going to be something that is where sensory information comes in. We're going to have an afferent neuron, which is going to be or sometimes called an afferent neuron, or a sensory neuron. That's going to take information from the receptor and into either the brain or spinal cord, depending on where it needs to go. After the sensory neuron, or the afferent neuron, it's going to synapse with another neuron called an interneuron, which is in between two neurons. It is going to be the one that makes the decision as to what to do. What we will then do is that interneuron is going to synapse with another neuron called an efferent, properly efferent, but efferent or exiting or motor neuron, that will send that information on out. And when it sends that information out, it's going to end up synapsing with either a muscle or a gland. We call those the effectors. Those are the 5 components of reflexes. I would highly recommend that you know those 5 components. The receptor has to deal with senses, and we claim that there's only 5 senses. We have more than 5 senses, but the 5 basic ones, which are seeing and smelling and hearing and tasting and touching, all of those basically are receptors. And if we can trigger a receptor to send out an action potential, the result is we can trigger a reflex. Ultimately, it's going to run through 3 neurons, so the afferent or sensory, the interneuron, and the efferent or the motor neurons. And those will eventually synapse with either a muscle or a gland. When it synapses with a muscle or a gland, it's either going to make it work or it's going to make it not work. Part of reflexes can turn off a muscle or turn off a gland. They don't always need to be activating things. We could actually shut things off, because that's perfectly legitimately possible as well. Depends on the reflex. When I look at that interneuron, if the interneuron is found inside of the brain, we call that a cranial reflex. Cranial reflexes we are going to deal with a lot later on. One of the giveaways that you're dealing with a cranial reflex is outside of your testing something in the head area. One of the things you could also end up testing for is if you look at the name of the neuron that turns out to be the sensory or the afferent neuron. If it turns out to have a weird name like olfactory or optic or oculomotor or trigeminal or abducence or facial or vestibulocochlear or something along those lines, that's also a giveaway that you're dealing with a cranial reflex. Most reflexes, however, are going to be neck and down, and those we call spinal reflexes because the interneuron is inside of the spinal cord. The giveaway that you know it's going to be in the spinal cord is you'll find out that, this neuron is a C3 neuron, meaning it's the third cervical neuron, or from the third cervical nerve, and it's a neuron of that. Or it's an L1, meaning it came from the nerve that came out of the first nerve to come out of the lumbar region of your back. Most of the neurons, most of the reflexes we're going to deal with, wow, I can't talk in this video, are going to deal with spinal reflexes. Why do we care about any of this stuff? It turns out reflexes, so receptor, send it, process it, send information out, do something about it, is actually a reflex, is a homeostatic mechanism. It's actually negative feedback. It actually turns out to be something that we have been dealing with the entire time. And instead of calling it negative feedback or positive feedback loops, we could have just called them reflexes. So we're going to be dealing with a lot of reflexes, so it helps if we have basic terminology and basic parts down.